This is East Asia Tonight.
Good evening, I'm Ateli Edwards. Tonight's top stories from East Asia. Japan seizes a Chinese fishing boat inside its exclusive economic zone in disputed waters off Nagasaki. The captain was arrested for evading inspection as Beijing calls for crew protection under a fisheries pact. North Korea issues a fresh drone warning to its neighbor, calling Seoul's probe sensible but vowing a terrible response if another drone crosses into its airspace. World leaders head to the Munich Security Conference with America's top diplomat Marco Rubio and China's Wang Yi under the same roof. Behind the scenes, mounting questions over the U.S.'s dependability as a NATO ally. Washington and Taipei seal a deal to cut tariffs and ramp up Taiwanese purchases of U.S. goods. Meanwhile, Japan says significant gaps persist, with Washington over Tokyo's $550 billion investment plan. Also tonight, Russian tourists heading to Japan will soon have an easier time getting a visa. But while visitor numbers are up, long-standing historical issues and the war in Ukraine continue to stifle relations. China's foreign ministry has urged for the rights of the crew aboard a Chinese fishing vessel be protected after Japanese authorities seized the boat earlier today.
中国政府一贯要求中国的渔民依法依规作业，同时坚决维护中国渔民的合法权益。希望日方严格遵守中日渔业协定，公正执法，保障中方船员安全和合法权益。
Now, the vessel was found within Japan's exclusive economic zone off the coast of Nagasaki Prefecture. 11 people were on board, including the captain, who is a Chinese national.
2月12日木曜日の午後0時ごろ、屋久島西方の我が国の排他的経済水域において、水産庁漁業取締船が立ち入り検査を拒否した中国漁船の船長を逮捕したと承知しています。現在、捜査中でありますが、外国漁船による違法操業の防止及び抑止のため、今後とも毅然とした対応で取締り活動に取り組んでまいります。
For more, we are joined now by our senior correspondent Michio Ishida live from Tokyo. So, Mitch, we have heard China's side. What about Tokyo, though? I mean, are they issuing any complaints to Beijing regarding the incident?
Well, Minister Norikazu Suzuki of Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries was asked during his regular news conference on Friday afternoon whether the Japanese government was issuing a complaint. His response was, the incident was under investigation. Factual check had to be conducted first. Now, he gave details of what he was aware happened. At 8 a.m. on Thursday, Japan time, Fisheries Agency's inspection vessel Hakuo Maru spotted a Chinese tiger net fishing vessel. Hakuo Maru ordered the boat to stop, but instead the boat tried to escape. The Fisheries Agency staff then boarded the boat and at around noon arrested the captain based on the act of the exercise of the sovereign right for fishery in the exclusive economic zone. Now, Kyushu Fisheries Coordination Office posted on its website, Hakuho Maru is supposed to, with 3 more vessels, inspecting, in an inspecting procedure. And it's the first case of a fishing boat, seized or its captain arrested this year. That is a foreign boat. And during the past 8 years, seizures or arrests were limited to perhaps 1 or none a year.
And, Michio, I know investigations are still ongoing, but do you think this incident in any way will further strain bilateral ties?
Well, ties are already quite strained, between Japan and China ever since Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi referred to the Taiwan contingency as a circumstance when Japan could exercise collective self-defense. This, if you recall, angered Beijing. And since Beijing called on its citizens to refrain from traveling to Japan, many Chinese airlines suspended their flights to Japan. A number of mainland Chinese, the second biggest group of tourists to Japan last year, started to dip. And Beijing decided to ban exports of materials which Japan could use to build up its defense capabilities. And this included the possibilities of rare earth materials. But whether the fishing boat incident will have a direct impact is a wait and see. It's hoped not to flare up as in 2010. That was when a Chinese fishing boat collided with Japan's inspection vessels near Senkaku Islands, which China calls Diaoyi. And the Chinese captain was arrested. The Japanese government back then was under the control of the Democratic Party of Japan, not the Liberal Democrats as it is today. And taking into account the China ties at that time, the captain was released without charges. So we shall just wait and see what will happen to the captain of the boat, which was seized this time.
Oh, wait and see we shall. Thanks very much for that report, CNA senior correspondent Michio Ishida reporting to us from Tokyo. North Korea has warned of a terrible response should any South Korean drone intrude into the North's airspace again. According to state media KCNA, Kim Yo-jong, sister of leader Kim Jong-un, called Seoul's probe into the incident a, quote, sensible action. South Korea had initially denied any involvement in a January incident in which Pyongyang said it shot down a surveillance drone near its industrial hub of Kaesong. Well, Ms. Kim wants South Korean authorities to take preventive measures to avoid a repeat of what she called provocative sovereignty violation. Pyongyang previously led a campaign of sending balloons filled with garbage to the south in response to such drone launches in 2024. Now, the South's Ministry of Unification said that the drone incident goes against its principle of peaceful coexistence with the North, and Seoul will work to prevent any recurrence. The South Korean investigators earlier this week raided offices of its spy agency over possible government links to the drone incursion. The drone was reportedly carrying surveillance equipment and had stored footage of what Pyongyang claims to be important targets, including border areas. A South Korea spy agency revealed earlier that Kim Jong-un is taking steps to consolidate his daughter's position as successor. While they are reportedly keeping a close watch on Kim Joo-ae amid speculation she could be providing input on policy matters. Now, she has been frequently and prominently featured in state media in recent years, accompanying her father on field tours, including the inspections of weapon projects. The Munich Security Conference, an event focused on global security policy changes, begins today. Some 70 heads of state and more than 140 ministers are among foreign attendees at the three-day conference, including U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi. The conference comes amid questions over long-standing alliances and partnerships, as well as what's seen as the eroding of the rules-based international order. Now, for more on this, we are joined now by Will Denslow, who is covering the story for CNA live from Munich. Will, so tell us, what can we expect on the table on the first day?
Well, heading to this conference, we've heard from Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State, who said that the world is entering what he described as a new era of geopolitics. He says that what is required is to re-examine what exactly that'll look like. So really, that is helping to frame what exactly we can expect from this year's Munich Security Conference. There'll be a range of panels really looking at those issues in its minutiae, issues such as global trade, the threat of tariffs that, of course, have become so prevalent since US President Donald Trump took office, issues such as institutions globally, the likes of Kaja Kallas, the EU's top diplomat, will be sharing a panel with the US ambassador to the United Nations. Also, a number of topics: Japan's place in the world, maritime security, where Singapore's defense minister will be speaking as well. And, of course, the issue of the war in Ukraine. A panel will be held on the state of Russia, as well as what security guarantees can be provided for Kyiv.
And Will, what are some of the outstanding issues or challenges that you think might seep into today's talks, and how would that shape the outcome of the event?
Well, of course, it's very difficult to think about this year's security conference without framing it to what happened about 12 months ago when the US vice president essentially issued somewhat of a scorched earth policy, really railing against traditional allies, namely its allies in Europe. So it'll be very interesting to see what exactly Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State, will have to say when he takes the podium on Saturday. Of course, there's been plenty of speculation as to how the relationship has changed between European allies, their transatlantic partners over in the United States. So this will be a huge framing of many of these debates we can expect over the next few days. Wang Yi, China's foreign minister, will also be attending, speaking just after the US Secretary of State on Saturday. Very interesting to hear exactly what Beijing's perspective is as well as this conference starts to get underway here in Munich.
I'll certainly be looking out for that. Thanks so much, Wilbert Denslow, covering the Munich Security Conference for CNA. And of course, we'll be having more on what's at stake at this year's conference when we speak with Anja Manuel, Executive Director of the Aspen Strategy Group and Aspen Security Forum, a little later this hour. Time now for another short break, but coming up on East Asia Tonight, stock markets in the region decline following another tech-led plunge on Wall Street as investors reassess their vast AI investments. Plus, despite the worries, enthusiasm for artificial intelligence shows no signs of slowing down. Anthropic secures the second largest private tech fundraising round on record, staggering $30 billion. Hello again. Good to have your company this Friday evening. It is now time to get your business update with none other than Olivia Marzuki. So, Olivia, all eyes on Taiwan's economic outlook. Apparently, it's getting a sharp upgrade, all thanks to the fueled by AI momentum.
That's right, Oteli. So the island's dominance in advanced chip making is once again putting it at the center of the global tech race. Taiwan's tech-reliant economy is expected to grow faster than previously predicted, riding the wave of strong demand for AI technology. Officials expect the GDP to expand by 7.71% this year, more than double the 3.54% pace predicted in November. Taiwan plays a pivotal role in the global AI supply chain for companies such as NVIDIA and Apple. Its position anchored by the world's largest maker of chips, obviously, TSMC. Now, the upgrade follows a US-Taiwan trade agreement confirming lower US tariffs on the island's goods, alongside Taipei's commitment to boost purchases of American products. Under this deal, Taiwan's agreed to remove or reduce 99% of its tariff barriers. Most of the island's exports to the U.S. will be taxed at a 15% rate, down from 20%, the same as that levied on Japan and South Korea. More than 2,000 Taiwanese goods, including bubble tea ingredients, will be exempted from reciprocal tariffs. Taiwan will also increase purchases of U.S. products, including LNG and crude oil, as well as civil aircraft and engines. The deal is expected to have wide-ranging implications for Asia's most valuable company, TSMC, which plans major investments in the U.S. U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer said it builds on long-standing economic and trade ties with Taiwan. The agreement comes as the U.S. remains reliant on Taiwan for chip production, which helped drive a trade gap of nearly $127 billion in the first 11 months of 2025. Taiwan's president struck an upbeat tone, saying that growth will remain steady as long as research, development, and manufacturing stay on the island.
这一次的这个关税谈判也是一个非常重要的这一个机会了哈，目的就是要这样，目的就是要让产业可以走得出去。那不管是台积电或其他的产业，只要他们的研发中心在台湾，他们的先进制程在台湾，只要最大的产量在台湾，台湾就能够持续稳定的发展。
Japanese Trade Minister Ryosei Akazawa and U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick have not reached an agreement on which projects will be funded under Tokyo's $550 billion investment pledge. Mr. Akazawa says it is still too early to decide what will be in the first batch of the U.S.-Japan investment scheme and that a significant gap remains between the two countries. He added that companies from both sides will earn solid profits and will not be engaging in risky ventures. Some of the sectors of interest between Washington and Tokyo were data center infrastructure, deep sea energy, and semiconductor manufacturing. Mr. Akazawa and Mr. Lutnick also discussed how to diversify their supplies of critical minerals. Mr. Akazawa said that he would continue negotiating ahead of Japanese Prime Minister Sanai Takaichi's planned visit to the U.S. in March. Tokyo agreed to commit more than $500 billion in investment in the U.S. as part of a deal with Washington, which saw the U.S. slash tariffs on Japanese imports to 15%. East Asian markets ending the week mostly in the red, tracking losses on Wall Street led by sell-off in tech shares, which is spreading into other sectors as fears mount over business disruptions caused by artificial intelligence. Shares of SoftBank down almost 9%, dragged down the Nikkei 225 by 334 points. But chip-related companies, Advantest and Tokyo Electron, bucked that trend, ending the day in the green. South Korean equities largely down as investors take profit ahead of a long weekend. Samsung Electronics there 1.4% to the upside, but SK Hynix and LG Energy in negative territory, more than 3.6% down for LG. Anxiety over AI's impact has been building up in recent weeks and only intensified since startup Anthropic released a legal tool, sparking a sell-off, wiping out almost $300 billion in value from software and financial services stocks in a single session last week. Those fears are now spreading into the logistics, real estate, and insurance sectors. Earlier this week, a stronger than expected U.S. jobs report also fueled worries that the Fed would now be less likely to cut rates, and investors are keeping their eyes for a key inflation report due out tonight. Anthropic has secured the second largest private tech fundraising round on record, closing a $30 billion funding round earlier today, underscoring strong investor interest in the company and also the broader AI industry. The round was led by Singaporean sovereign wealth fund GIC and Coatue Management, an American hedge fund focused on technology. The creator of Claude has now a valuation of $380 billion. That is more than twice what it was worth in September last year during its last funding round. The company says fresh capital infusion will support building out their infrastructure, research, and investment into enterprise-grade products. Anthropic has distinguished itself in the AI market by focusing on the enterprise market and training its model on coding. In contrast, its main competitor, OpenAI, mostly targets individual consumers, thanks in part to the popularity of ChatGPT. Both Anthropic and OpenAI are reportedly looking to go public during the second half of this year. U.S. President Donald Trump is reportedly planning to scale back some tariffs on steel and aluminum after mounting concerns over high prices in the U.S. The levies, as high as 50%, were imposed on metal last year and later extended to everyday products, washing machines, ovens, food cans, and even pie tins. But officials now believe that tariffs may be fueling affordability crisis, weighing on American voters ahead of November's midterms. According to a recent poll by Pew Research, 72% of Americans rate the current economy as fair or poor. More than half think that Trump's policies have actually made things worse. The potential tariff policy U-turn could benefit major trading partners like Canada, Mexico, and the EU and help ease global supply chains currently under strain. The Trump administration has already granted exemptions for popular food items to help ease soaring grocery costs. It has also agreed to a temporary truce in its trade dispute with China after Beijing responded with retaliatory tariffs. And a new report showed that Americans are paying for almost all of Trump's tariffs. Finding by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York highlight that 90% of the levies are actually borne by U.S. consumers and companies. That goes against the Trump administration's argument that they are paid for by other nations. The New York Fed said they found that foreign exporters did not lower their prices when tariffs were dialed down. There was 100% pass-through from tariffs into import prices. The findings coincide with the report from the Congressional Budget Office this week. It said, in the near term, U.S. businesses will absorb 30% of import price increases by reducing their profit margins, and the remaining 70% will be passed through to consumers by raising prices. Western sanctions were meant to choke off supply, but instead, tens of thousands of Chinese vehicles are now crowding Russian roads. Here's how a lucrative gray market for cars took shape between the two countries.
Tens of thousands of cars are being exported to Russia via China, despite sanctions and company pledges that follow Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Among them are Toyotas and German luxury models. That's according to data from Russian research firm Autostat and interviews with people involved in the trade. Most of the imported cars are made in China, where many global brands have factories. A growing number of those are sold as zero-mileage used vehicles. Those cars are bought brand new in China and then reclassified as used and exported. One car trader based in Sichuan says the practice skirts the need to get automaker approval for sales to Russia. Zero-mileage cars are sold cheaply in China but fetch similar prices to new cars in Russia. That's according to a Russian dealer and vehicle shipping document reviewed by Reuters. Dmitry Zazlin is the sales director of Moscow car dealership Naftozapad.
Не могу ответить за всех, да, кто как сейчас продает автомобили, но импорт вообще автомобилей очень большой. Поэтому возят из разных стран, из разных государств и новые автомобили с пробегом. Если посмотреть последние отчеты автостата, то автомобили с пробегом в большей степени начал расти, да, показывать хороший рост по импорту автомобилей. Поэтому здесь я думаю, что есть, наверное, не совсем честные игроки, к сожалению, на нашем рынке, которые пытаются автомобили с пробегом продать как новый. Но мы этим и занимаемся.
Automakers that prohibit sales to Russia say they are doing their best to prevent unauthorized exports. In a statement, Mercedes said probing breaches was, quote, time-consuming and complex, saying it requires third-party assistance. BMW said it had told its Chinese dealers to strictly oppose potential exports to Russia.
So that's all I have in business for now. Telly, you're up to date. Happy Friday.
Happy Friday to you as well. Thanks so much for that, Olivia. Well, we are going to go for another break now, but coming up next on East Asia tonight, US-China rivalry and President Donald Trump's break with Europe likely to loom large over the Munich Security Conference that begins today. I'll be speaking to an analyst who is at this year's gathering on what's at stake. This is East Asia tonight, and here are the headlines you are following. Japan seizes a Chinese fishing boat inside its exclusive economic zone in waters off Nagasaki for illegal fishing. China has called for a fisheries pact to be upheld to ensure the crew's safety. And North Korea warns of a terrible response should any South Korean drone intrude into its airspace again, but acknowledges Seoul's probe of the first incident as sensible. And America's and China's top diplomats under the same roof as world leaders gather for the Munich Security Conference. The erosion of world order amid upheavals from Donald Trump's demands, among issues topping the agenda. And for more, let's bring in Anja Manuel, Executive Director, Aspen Strategy Group and Aspen Security Forum, who will be moderating one of the panels at the Munich Security Conference. Well, good to have you with us, Anja. Perhaps first up, I know that you have mentioned a lot about all the behind-the-scenes talk about whether the U.S. can stay as a strong NATO ally. When you listen into all these conversations, what is the one concern you keep hearing over and over again?
Yeah, so happy to be with you and with your audience. It's getting crowded here in Munich. Delegations are arriving by the minute. I think the American senators are showing up, as well as Marco Rubio. And of course, of our European friends who are here, there's been a lot of worry about how much lecturing and hectoring the United States has done of Europe, and whether that means that they need to stand on their own 2 feet. I would just add, some of that is long overdue and important. So NATO, countries outside of America spending more on their own defense, that's important, and it's long overdue. Doing more in technology, all of that is great. But I think all of us here hoping that the alliance will hold together, which I think it will.
And what do you think they need to see from Washington, to feel more reassured?
Yeah, I think you're going to see a softer tone from Secretary of State Rubio, who is coming. There's some parts of the Trump administration talk about Europe having to rejuvenate itself, having to be competitive again. I think some of those criticisms are accurate and important, and I think if said politely, the Europeans would actually agree. And I think Marco Rubio is just the person to say the same thing, but say it with a softer touch.
Also at Munich this year, we've got key US, Chinese officials both attending under the same roof. What do you think the big US-China conversations will be centering on?
Yes. Well, as you know, there is a summit coming up between President Xi and President Trump in a couple of months. We understand that the Treasury Secretary Bessent has been made in charge of the economic part leading up to that summit. So my guess would be that there'll be a lot of conversations here if Marco Rubio and Wang Yi get to see each other about what's going to be discussed at that summit. What are the deliverables, as we call them? Is it going to be mostly on trade? Are they going to also discuss security and technology? I think pretty much everything will be on the table.
So we've got China's top diplomat Wang Yi, he's here, and also we've got Europe talking more openly about, strategic independence. So where do you see the biggest opening for Beijing?
Well, I think China wants to trade with the world, and that is all well and good and very important. It just needs to be done with a level playing field. I think when you see pushback against China, it's because in so many of Western industries, but also you see it in Singapore and elsewhere in Southeast Asia, that Chinese companies come in and really hollow out what was the industrial base of that country. So that's what people are concerned about. I would say also, I live in Silicon Valley in California, of course, the forefront of the AI revolution. What we see from the technology side is the Chinese being excellent at AI, especially how quickly they're moving AI through their entire society, how much they're doing on robotics, how fast they're building some of these data centers. So that's creating a lot of worry, I think, both in the US and in Europe.
And just back to Munich, it brings us to this bigger theme that people keep coming back to here. And there's a lot of talk about this wrecking ball politics, basically allies worrying about basic things like, whether the U.S. congressional delegation was even going to show up in the first place. But if allies sort of see more volatility in U.S. politics, then do you think then that makes U.S.-China rivalry more dangerous?
I don't know if it makes it more dangerous. It is true that the theme of the Munich Security Conference report said wrecking ball politics. I think what you're seeing here is the international system really not standing up the way it needs to. It's been 70 years. Some of these organizations are creaking. They need to evolve. And sometimes you need people to come in and shake them up in order to evolve them. You're seeing this with NATO evolving. ASEAN is evolving a little bit. I hope we can do the same for the WTO and the UN. And does that make the US-China rivalry more dangerous? It is better when we have institutions to convene them, but I think it makes a difference on the margin. The rivalry is real. It's going to continue. And what you need is Americans and Chinese talking to each other as often as possible so there are no misunderstandings.
So bringing the mood back to Europe and its influence there, what do you think it does to the Indo-Pacific? I mean, does it introduce a new kind of uncertainty that, say, Japan and Korea and others have to perhaps plan around?
I think the uncertainty, frankly, I would say, is caused by China. I mean, you just reported it at the bottom of the hour that their fishing boats, incursions into Japanese waters. I think, as we all know, some of those Chinese fishing boats are also affiliated with the Chinese military. What you see the Chinese military doing around Taiwan is getting all of a sudden. Okay.
Anja? We can hear you fine.
Yep. I think I lost you somehow. Okay, great.
Can
Wonderful.
You hear me now?
Sorry, somebody else broke in. So, yeah, can you hear me?
Yep, perfect.
Great. Well, I think we were talking about Korea and Japan, and it is true that the Chinese are the incursions around Taiwan, and as you just reported, into Japanese seas are getting more and more difficult. And so I think as you see the relationship getting more competitive, you want those two militaries to really speak to each other. The Chinese, the Americans, and then, of course, with all of our allies in Asia as well.
So there's this Munich framing of the Indo-Pact with the allies perhaps feel torn, pull the U.S. closer, but also try to hedge, right? So in East Asia, from what you're seeing right now, can you say if anyone is hedging more effectively, once more than the other?
I don't see it. You probably see it more closely since you're in Singapore. What we hear from our Asian allies in the United States is that they want positive, peaceful relations with both, which is completely understandable. Nobody wants to choose sides. But I think there's also an increasing recognition, especially amongst the Quad members, Japan, Australia, India, the United States. But I think you also see it in other Asian nations that as China expands its military presence, it makes it dangerous and unstable in a way that nobody in Asia should want.
Well, many insights there to unpack. Thanks so very much for your time and thoughts. All the best in your moderating. Maybe tomorrow, Anja, Manuel, Executive Director, Aspen Strategy Group and Aspen Security Forum. Now, China has vowed to take all necessary measures against foreign spying after the U.S. released a CIA recruitment video aimed at Chinese military officers. The short clip the American agency posted to its YouTube channel appears to be aimed at exploiting potential political fallout in Beijing from a years-long crackdown on military corruption, including the purging of its top generals. Now, Beijing's response comes a day after the U.S. spy agency rolled out this video featuring a disillusioned Chinese military officer encouraging potential informants to work with the CIA. It follows a similar effort last May, focused on fictional figures within China's ruling party, while providing detailed instructions on how to securely contact U.S. intelligence. Now, CIA officials say the online campaign has reached millions and will continue offering Chinese government officials what it described as, quote, opportunity to work towards a brighter future together. Coming up on East Asia tonight, braving long queues in the cold for visas may soon be a thing of the past for Russians hoping to visit Japan. Japan is opening new visa centers in Moscow and St. Petersburg as more Russians look to the country as a top holiday destination. Well, it offers Russian vacationers an alternative to Europe and other Western nations, which have become more difficult to get to since the Russia-Ukraine war started. Well, Dasha Chernyshova files this report for CNA from Moscow.
For the past year, lines outside the Japanese embassy in Moscow have grown longer as more and more Russians brave the elements to apply for Japanese visas.
Здесь будет здорово, сможешь записаться, детей подать небольшой консульский сбор. Мы сегодня простояли долго, еще стоим, но в целом быстро очень двигается. Все равно визовый центр, мне кажется, разгрузили чуть-чуть.
they don't have to wait much longer. Japan has just opened new visa application centers in Moscow and St. Petersburg to ease wait times and handle the growing demand away from the cold.
More Russians look east for travel options, and Japan appears firmly near the top of their holiday wish list. All that despite geopolitical tensions and uneasy relations between Moscow and Tokyo. But people-to-people contacts remain strong, and Japan's doors are opening wider to Russian tourists.
In 2025, almost 200,000 Russians visited Japan, nearly double the figures from the year before. It comes as sanctions and travel restrictions tied to the conflict with Ukraine limit European travel options for many Russians, while a weaker Japanese yen, improved flight connectivity and visa-free tourist entry make Japan a very attractive alternative.
Это тренд, который не прекратится в ближайшие годы, потому что первое – виза, более доступный перелет, который стал. У нас нет прямых рейсов сейчас, и это немного сдерживает этот спрос. Но зато у нас есть те перевозчики, которые дают прекрасные тарифы. С учетом закрывшейся емкости рынка в Евросоюзе, мы получили прекрасную аудиторию, которая готова, любит, знает и готова воспринимать экскурсионный продукт там и, собственно говоря, этим пользуется и не готова ждать, что вот что-то другое откроется, более доступное.
Russians who have already traveled to Japan say they definitely want to go there again. Affordability is a big draw too.
Однозначно доступность плюс другие экономические условия в Японии. То есть наша инфляция, японская инфляция – это очень разные вещи. И когда ты туда приезжаешь, ты понимаешь, что абсолютно все тебе выгодно. От каких-то люксовых брендов. Я знаю людей, которые туда за люксом ездят, потому что в Европе все гораздо дороже.
It's unclear how much of this demand is due to travel restrictions over the conflict or what might happen if a peace deal is reached. But most signs suggest that strong Russian interest in Japan holidays is likely to continue for the foreseeable future. For CNA, I'm Dasha Cherneshova in Moscow.
Well, the tourist boom reflecting a thaw in people-to-people contact, but a long-standing territorial dispute remains between Japan and Russia, and it centers on 4 islands seized by Soviet forces in the closing days of World War II. Known in Japan as the Northern Territories, Tokyo maintains they are its inherent territory. Well, today they're administered by Russia as part of the Southern Kuril Islands. Now, the dispute carries human and diplomatic cost. For decades, it has prevented the two sides from concluding a formal post-World War II peace treaty, despite multiple diplomatic efforts. Now, Russia withdrew from negotiations with Japan in 2022 and barred aging former residents from visiting ancestral graves on the islands after Tokyo sanctioned Moscow for its invasion of Ukraine. Now, Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi has made addressing the status of the Northern Territories and regaining access for former residents among her top priorities. Just last week, the leader voiced regret over the issue more than 80 years since the end of World War II. For more on this, we are joined now by James Brown, Professor of Political Science from Temple University, Japan. Well, thanks, Professor Brown, for joining us this evening. So, the contrast is pretty striking here. Japanese making it easier for Russians to travel to Japan, but the humanitarian visits for former Japanese residents to the disputed Northern Territories remain frozen. So, Professor, if you could just walk us through the logic of that contrast. What exactly is Tokyo trying to prioritize here?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that we can see such a clear contrast between the approach of Japan and that of, for instance, European countries who have taken the view that alongside the economic sanctions, alongside the difficult political relations, they also need to place restrictions on people-to-people ties and cultural educational exchanges. Now, Japan's not taken that position. They have introduced a great number of sanctions on Russia. They've provided a lot of support for Ukraine as well. But from the point of view of the Japanese government, they want to make it very clear that their objection is not to Russia, is not to the Russian people, and it's only with the conflict. And so that's why they've decided to not only allow the continuation of tourism, but actually to take steps to boost it, with the latest of those things being to open up these 2 new visa centers, one in Moscow and one in St. Petersburg.
So I hear what you're saying. So in other words, Japan is doing this out of goodwill, that, that they're not using it to perhaps open up negotiations on other issues?
Well, I mean, this is international politics, so it's never just about goodwill. It's also about Japan hoping to get agreement from Russia on the restart of visits for the former residents of the disputed islands. Now, that community was forcibly evicted from those islands when they were seized by Soviet forces in 1945. That community has dwindled, but there are still a few thousand left. Their average age is around 90. And it's the dear hope of the Japanese government that before the end of these people's lives, that they would be able to return to the islands, to visit ancestral graves, to set foot on their on their homeland. And the Russian government has not permitted that. So it's the hope that it's the hope from the Japanese side that they can get an agreement on that, if not on the broader issue of resolving the territorial dispute.
So from Russia's point of view, I mean, what's the strategic value here of keeping this dispute unresolved? And I mean, any chance at all of seriously engaging in a peace treaty again?
Well, it's worth separating the two issues. What you have is the territorial matter and then the peace treaty. The reason why there's no peace treaty that's been signed is because Japan refuses to sign the peace treaty until the territorial issue has been resolved. So from the Russian government's point of view, they say, if you want a peace treaty, we can negotiate that. What we're not willing to talk about is the return of the islands, because from the Russian point of view, these were rightfully gained by the Soviet Union as a result of their victory in World War II. That's Moscow's perspective. So they say, peace treaty fine, but not territorial negotiations.
So let's just talk about the new Prime Minister, Sanae Takaichi. She's taken on a more hawkish, nationalist-leaning leader, somebody like her. How do you see her driving Japan-Russia policy, and where would you, expect the biggest change to show up, if at all?
Well, I think that there is going to be a lot of change in Japanese politics as a result of Takaichi's extraordinary win in the election. And there are some who speculate that she might try and follow her mentor, the late former Prime Minister Abe Shinzo. Now, he did try and improve relations with Russia. Between 2012 and 2020, he really tried everything to try and get a resolution to the dispute and improve relations, and it didn't work out. So I think that although some people expect that on many issues, Takaichi will follow Abe, I think here will be something different. I think that she will look at the experience of Abe, that he really tried everything, it didn't work out. I don't think she's going to go down that same route, especially since the environment is now so different. When Abe was engaging with Russia, we didn't have the war in Ukraine.
So you've mentioned that she might perhaps take on a different track from, her mentor Shinzo Abe. But, we've seen like this every few years, there's another summit, there's another sort of reset in relations, but the needle hasn't seemed to move. So this particular dispute, why is it so resistant to diplomacy?
Yeah, I think the main thing is that Russia has control of the islands. And from the Russian point of view, these are militarily important because they guard the entrance way to the Sea of Okhotsk, which is important for Russian nuclear submarines. Further to that, after the eviction of the original Japanese population, you now have Russians living there. There's a population of around 18,000. So from the Russian point of view, they think, well, of course we're not going to give up these islands for the military reason that we would be giving them to a US ally. We would be undermining our nuclear deterrent. And then also because it's against the wishes of the Russian population overall and also against the wishes of the Russians that live there. So that's why the Russians are so insistent that they're not going to budge on this issue.
Oh, thanks so much for helping us unpack Japan-Russia tensions. Thanks for your time. James Brown, Professor of Political Science from Temple University, Japan. Well, China has released the full-year marriage figures for 2025, and they paint a slightly positive picture. 6.76 million couples got married in 2025, last year. That's an increase of 10% from 2024, which was a record low. The number of marriages is closely watched by Chinese authorities, as there is the general belief that more marriages might produce more babies. And as you can see, there's been a downward trend in the number of marriages. Last year, the number of births itself also fell to an all-time low, a double whammy for a country that has an aging population. Well, young people not having children is also a worry for parents concerned with carrying on the family name. Now, many are relying on an age-old method to find their children a spouse, even in a modern city like Shanghai. Crystal Chia with this report.
Making sure their children get married and have babies remains something that many parents care deeply about in China.
I'm here at Shanghai's marriage market, located in the city center. It's a gathering of parents, matchmaking agencies, and singles of all ages. Every weekend at People's Park in Shanghai, anxious parents are helping their children look for their other half, often without their knowledge. Posters display their children's ages, jobs, appearance, and financial assets. This uncle initially came to the market to help his daughter find a partner. Now, he comes here almost every weekend as a hobby. He guides visitors on what's where: the younger people section, the older people section, and where I was directed to, an overseas section. 现在的年轻人，我会觉得他们可能想说，为什么要结婚？为什么要什么的？
为什么呢？因为呢，我们国家呢，不像我们6个小孩，他们以后呢，像这个80的、70的，我们国家有个政策，独生子女。独生子女呢，他就是独立性的，以他为中心。像我们上面有哥哥、有姐姐、有弟弟、有妹妹，我们这个呢，小时候到现在。 还是很亲情的，谁有困难，我要帮助。但是他是采访，他们没有像我们这个一代这种的父母亲留下来的子女这个一种的财产，就是那个，他们是一个中心，小姑娘也独立，男的也是独立的，所以他们呢这样一弄的话呢，婚姻就很烦了。
When we talk to younger Chinese, particularly younger Chinese singles, about like what are the things which concern them, why aren't they getting married, what are their concerns, those underlying issues have not really changed very much, right? These issues around getting a good job, around stability at work, around working, once you're in work, working hours and working culture, around getting a house, around, getting around dating, around getting started in life, right? And this kind of atomization of society and younger people.
Authorities across the country have been hard at work, coming up with creative ways to entice people to get married. Some provinces are offering up to a month in marriage leave. But it will take time to gauge how successful incentives are in actually boosting the marriage and birth rates in China. Crystal Chia, CNA, Shanghai.
Now, a giant sinkhole has appeared at a Shanghai subway construction site after a section collapsed. No casualties have been reported. Well, the accident occurred at a work site for a metro line. Issues started on Wednesday morning when a water leak was reported at a section of the construction site. Experts say that the leak likely triggered internal soil erosion, undermining foundations and causing the sudden collapses. The 44-kilometer is a major north-south corridor in Shanghai's metro network with a total investment of $5.3 billion. Construction of the subway began in mid-2021 and is expected to be completed in 2028, 3 years later than originally planned. And that wraps up Friday's edition of East Asia Tonight. Don't forget your headlines anytime at cna.asia. And look us up on Facebook and YouTube. Thanks for watching.